ancient heart of Persia, where the winds whispered secrets of 1,000 gods, one man stood against the tides of tradition. His name was Zarathustra, and his vision would ignite a revolution, one that would echo through the corridors of time. Imagine a world where the gods were many, where rituals demanded sacrifice, and where the forces of chaos and order clashed in the hearts of men. Then, in the midst of this spiritual turmoil, a single voice broke through the noise, daring to challenge everything. Zarathustra, the mystic prophet, rejected the gods of his ancestors and embraced a radical truth, a singular god, Ahura Mazda, who represented light, truth, and order. But this was not just a theological shift. This was a challenge to the very foundations of society itself. His message of good thoughts, good words, good deeds would become a moral code that transcended the bounds of his own people, laying the groundwork for a new way of understanding the divine. But as his teaching spread, so did the forces of resistance. From the highest echelons of power to the everyday lives of common people, Zarathustra's revolutionary ideas would either rise to reshape the future or be stamped out by the very world that had given birth to them. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I'll take you through the timeline of the whole story of Zoroastrianism, from its radical beginnings in ancient Persia to its rise as one of the world's most influential religions. We'll explore the vision of Zarathustra, the prophet who challenged a polytheistic world, and the opposition he faced as his revolutionary ideas began to spread. I'll walk you through how Zoroastrianism gained royal recognition under King Vishtaspa, how it faced internal and external challenges, and how the faith survived and adapted through centuries of turmoil. By the end of this video, you'll have a complete understanding of the legacy this ancient faith has left on our world today. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to hit that button. If you're not subscribing, we'd love to hear why. Please share your thoughts with us in the comments. We'd love to know. In the mystical expanse of ancient Persia, the land stretched across vast plateaus and majestic mountain ranges beneath skies that had seen the rise and fall of empires. This was a place where the natural world was sacred and the divine presence could be felt in every gust of wind and every flicker of flame. The spiritual landscape of ancient Persia was shaped by a complex and intricate pantheon of gods, each one representing the forces of nature, life, and death. The land was home to gods of war, gods of fertility, and gods who governed the cycles of the seasons. These were not abstract, far-off deities, but forces woven into the fabric of everyday life. For the ancient Persians, polytheism was not merely a system of belief, but a lens through which they viewed their world. The gods were believed to inhabit every aspect of life, from the rivers and mountains to the hearths of the home. They were present in the rituals of life and death, in the sacrifices made to ensure good harvests, and in the invocations whispered to protect against the dark forces that threatened the stability of society. Religion and ritual were woven into the very structure of daily life, shaping everything from family life to the conduct of rulers. Among these deities, one force stood above all: fire. Revered as the embodiment of divine light, fire was seen as a symbol of purity and truth, representing the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The Persians believed that by maintaining sacred fires, they were preserving not just the divine order, but the cosmic balance. These flames, which flickered in the sacred altars and temples of Persian cities, were far more than just sources of heat. They were living embodiments of the divine will, capable of purging darkness and evil from the world. The rituals surrounding fire were some of the most sacred, and the magi, the priests who oversaw these sacred fires, were seen as intermediaries between the gods and humankind. But the polytheism of ancient Persia, as deeply ingrained as it was, existed in a world that had long been marked by spiritual dualism. In the eyes of the ancient Persians, the world was shaped by the constant clash between Asha, truth, order, and Druj, falsehood, chaos. This cosmic conflict wasn't a far-off battle. It was one that was deeply embedded in the lives of the people. Society itself reflected this duality. Kings and priests who upheld the divine order were revered as defenders of Asha, while those who strayed into deception, greed, and violence were seen as agents of Druj. This moral framework was evident in Persian politics, where a king's duty was not just to rule, but to ensure that order prevailed over chaos, that justice was meted out in the name of the gods. Thus, when Zarathustra was born, he did not enter a neutral world. He entered a world saturated with divine forces, where the light of truth and the darkness of falsehood were not just concepts, but tangible, living forces that shaped every action and thought. The very fabric of Persian spirituality was a battleground between these forces, and the arrival of Zarathustra signaled a moment of deep spiritual upheaval. At the heart of Zarathustra's teachings lay the profound moral dualism that had long shaped the spiritual landscape of ancient Persia. Truth versus falsehood, Asha versus Druj. For the people of ancient Persia, this was not a mere philosophical abstraction. It was a living reality. Every day, each individual was called to align themselves with either truth or falsehood in their actions, their words, and their thoughts. The choices made by each person reverberated through the cosmic order, contributing either to the harmony of the world or its gradual decay. In the ancient world, The cosmic battle between good and evil was a universal theme. It wasn't just an abstract idea found in religious texts, but was also reflected in the daily experiences of individuals. The practice of good deeds and righteous thoughts was seen as sustaining the divine order, while the spread of lies, violence, and disorder was thought to empower the forces of evil. This moral landscape was reinforced through a system of rituals, ceremonies, and divine edicts that aimed to remind the people of their roles in the larger cosmic drama. The ancient Persians believed that by adhering to Asha, they could maintain the divine will on earth and ensure the balance between the forces of light and darkness. This concept of dualism went beyond just personal morality. It had political and societal implications. The king, seen as the earthly representative of divine order, was expected to embody the principles of Asha. He was the protector of truth, the defender of justice, and the guarantor of societal harmony. The priesthood, especially the Magi, played a crucial role in upholding this system, guiding the people in their efforts to align with divine will through rituals that reinforced the eternal battle between good and evil. But Zarathustra, in his divine revelation, would come to see this dualism not as something confined to the heavens, but as a challenge for humanity to engage with directly and consciously. The birth of Zarathustra occurred in a time of spiritual and moral tension, as ancient Persian society was already deeply entrenched in its polytheistic traditions. The arrival of this child, destined to change the world, was nothing short of cosmic significance. Even from the moment of his birth, the atmosphere was charged with divine anticipation. According to some ancient texts and oral traditions, celestial signs surrounded his arrival, unusual phenomena in the sky, a sudden brightness that illuminated the heavens, or the mysterious movement of the stars, as if to acknowledge the birth of a child who would one day challenge the very structure of the gods themselves. The supernatural signs were not simply decorative details in the narratives surrounding Zarathustra's birth. They were symbolic markers of the divine mission he was destined to undertake. His birth was not the beginning of a normal life, but the commencement of a spiritual revolution. The people of Persia saw his arrival as a fulfillment of prophecy, signaling the advent of a new spiritual age, one where the forces of Asha would gain ascendancy over the forces of Druj. In Zarathustra's early years, the signs of his divinely appointed mission became apparent. Miracles were attributed to him even as a child. Some stories speak of him performing acts that were thought to be impossible, while others describe him as having a profound understanding of the spiritual world that surpassed his years. The people of Persia did not view him simply as a child born into the world, but as a chosen one, whose life would serve as the bridge between a world steeped in deception and chaos, and a future where truth and righteousness could reign. Zarathustra's birth, therefore, was not just the beginning of an individual life, but the beginning of a new spiritual era, one that would rewrite the very fabric of Persian society, politics, and religion. It was clear that his path would not be an easy one. His teachings would face fierce opposition from the established powers of his time. But from the moment he was born, the forces of destiny were set in motion, and the world would never be the same. In the heart of ancient Persia, where the great rivers carved through fertile lands, and where towering mountains cast long shadows over the plains, the people lived by ritual and belief. Their world was one of ancient gods, gods of the earth, gods of the sky, and gods of war and peace. Yet beneath this pantheon of deities, Zarathustra, even as a young child, felt an unease, a gnawing sense of discomfort that set him apart from his peers. He was born into a society that revered a multitude of gods, each offering a different power and domain, from the fertility goddess Anahita to the god of wisdom, Mithra, and the creator god, Ahura Mazda, who was central to the faith of many. The ancient Persians were deeply tied to their rituals, with the Magi, the priestly class, orchestrating divine rites to keep the gods satisfied and maintain balance. Yet for Zarathustra, these rituals began to seem hollow, detached from the reality of the world he lived in. He asked the questions that many around him dared not. Why did the gods demand constant sacrifices and offerings when they seemed to leave the people in such suffering? Why did the rituals intended to honor the divine seem to have no real effect on the struggles of the people? In a world rife with war, famine, and despair, these questions grew louder. They were not merely academic. Zarathustra's discontent was existential. How could a world ruled by gods of such power and majesty also be one so filled with suffering and injustice? As a young man, Zarathustra could not ignore the inherent contradictions in the religious practices of his society. The gods seemed aloof, their demands unending, and the more he engaged with the rituals, the more disconnected he became. This dissonance between the spiritual and the earthly world was intolerable to him. While others blindly participated in these rituals, hoping for divine favor, Zarathustra began to see through their facade. It was not just the gods he questioned, but the entire system, the priesthood, the social order, and the rituals themselves. Zarathustra's questions set him on a path that would lead him into conflict, not just with the spiritual practices of his people, but with the political structures that upheld these beliefs. The priests and kings, the defenders of the old order, depended on the people's unquestioning devotion to the gods to maintain their political power. Zarathustra's skepticism was therefore not just a personal crisis, it was an ideological one that threatened the very structure of Persian society. As the questions within him deepened, Zarathustra realized that there were no answers to be found in the world he knew. The mighty city of Balkh, with its sprawling marketplaces and crowded temples, could not offer him the truth he sought. He needed space, solitude to sift through his doubts and his growing conviction that the spiritual system around him was deeply flawed. He left behind the comforts of his community and retreated to the desolate wilderness that lay beyond the great cities of Persia. The mountainous landscapes, the vast stretches of dry deserts, and the sparse vegetation became the backdrop of Zarathustra's spiritual pilgrimage. The wilderness, in all its rawness and isolation, offered a place where the noise of the world could be drowned out by the silence of the earth itself. The environment, harsh and unyielding, mirrored Zarathustra's own inner turmoil. The wind howled through the cracks of the jagged cliffs, its whispers carrying the weight of the ancient world's chaos. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, scorching his skin, while the cold of the night seeped into his bones, forcing him to confront not just the physical challenges of survival, but the psychic battles that raged within him. In the solitude, Zarathustra's mind became a crucible for the questions that had once felt overwhelming. It was here, far from the distractions of human society, that he began to contemplate the nature of good and evil, order and chaos, and the very cosmic laws that govern the universe. For days, weeks, and months, he meditated on these themes, experiencing the deepest isolation, yet also the clearest revelations. The silence of the land spoke to him, offering up insights that he could not find in the temples, nor from the priests. The very landscape around him seemed to embody the struggle between light and dark that was so central to the world he sought to understand. It was in this extreme spiritual isolation that Zarathustra began to recognize the truth, the duality of existence, the struggle between Asha, truth, order, and Druj, falsehood, chaos, was not just a cosmic battle. It was a moral choice that each individual must make daily. Truth was not a passive concept to be worshipped. It was an active force to be embodied and lived out. Then, as the culmination of his years of spiritual struggle and reflection, Zarathustra received a vision, the moment of divine revelation that would forever alter his life and the history of the world. It was not an ordinary vision, not a fleeting dream or an ephemeral moment. In the heart of the wilderness, as he sat alone under a vast star-filled sky, the air around him grew still, heavy with divine presence. And then Ahura Mazda, the supreme God of truth, appeared to him, not in the form of a physical figure, but as an overwhelming force of light and clarity, illuminating Zarathustra's soul. In that moment, Zarathustra felt the presence of absolute truth, a force both benevolent and terrifying, a divine clarity that shattered his previous understanding of the world. Ahura Mazda spoke to him, not in words, but in an inner voice, a profound and unspoken understanding that reached into Zarathustra's very core. The message was clear. Zarathustra was chosen to bring the truth to the people. He was to challenge the polytheistic world that had flourished for centuries and replace it with a new vision, a vision where the world was governed by one supreme God, Ahura Mazda, and where the people were called to live by truth and righteousness. The revelation was not a simple moment of clarity. It was a cosmic experience that overwhelmed Zarathustra. It was as if the weight of the universe had descended upon him, and for the first time, he saw the cosmic battle between Asha and Druj, not just as a myth, but as the central force of existence. He felt the urgency of his mission, the heavy responsibility to carry the message of divine truth to a world that was deeply entrenched in darkness. Zarathustra's heart raced, and his mind struggled to process the magnitude of the revelation. But he knew, without a doubt, that his purpose was clear. He was to lead the people out of darkness and into the light of Asha. His life, his very being, had been ordained for this mission. Zarathustra emerged from the wilderness, a changed man. He had found the truth he sought, not in the temples, not in the rituals, but in the clarity of divine revelation. He was no longer a lone figure wandering in search of answers. He was a prophet, divinely appointed to deliver a message that would challenge the very fabric of Persian society. His journey from questioning youth to divinely chosen prophet would shape the future of not just Persia, but the entire world. The path ahead would not be easy. Zarathustra knew the resistance he would face from the priests, the kings, and the common people who would struggle to accept such radical change. But armed with the truth that had been revealed to him in the wilderness, he was ready to face the world that would resist him. He was ready to spread the message of Asha and to illuminate the world with the light of truth. In the ancient world, polytheism was not just a religion. It was a way of life, intertwined with the political and social fabric of the time. Societies across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India were dominated by pantheons of gods, each with its own influence over various aspects of nature and human affairs. Babylon, with its own gods like Marduk, and Greece, where deities such as Zeus ruled over distinct spheres, represented worlds where the divine was seen as a multitude of competing, powerful forces. Yet in the midst of this religious plurality, Zarathustra introduced a radically different vision. Ahura Mazda, for Zarathustra, was not just the highest god in a pantheon, but the one and only supreme God, the creator, the sustainer, and the protector of truth. This was a monotheistic vision that directly confronted the polytheism that had shaped not only Persian religious practices, but those of the wider region. Ahura Mazda was fundamentally different from the gods of other cultures. In many pantheons, gods were capricious, vengeful, or driven by their own desires, often interacting with humans in ways that mirrored the flaws and desires of mortals. Ahura Mazda, in contrast, was an embodiment of wisdom and truth, qualities that were seen as pure and constant. He was not a god of ritual sacrifices, but one of righteous living. To follow Ahura Mazda was to align oneself with the divine order, which, as Zarathustra would later teach, required personal ethical commitment rather than the appeasement of a distant, temperamental deity. This vision of a singular, all-encompassing God was nothing short of revolutionary. For one, it radically transformed the spiritual hierarchy. No longer would multiple deities, each with its own domain and power, divide the attention and devotion of the people. Instead, the worship of Ahura Mazda consolidated religious life around a unified moral system. This monotheistic shift would lay the groundwork for future Abrahamic religions, but its impact extended beyond spirituality. The monotheistic vision of Ahura Mazda would also challenge the power dynamics of the religious class. The Magi, the priests who served the old polytheistic system, were now confronted with the idea that the divine was not to be appeased through sacrifices, but to be realized through righteous living. This fundamental shift threatened to undo their position as intermediaries between the people and the divine. Zarathustra's vision of Ahura Mazda was not just a theological construct, but a revolutionary idea that would ripple through the centuries, influencing the development of monotheism and shaping the way later societies viewed the relationship between the divine and the human. The idea of cosmic dualism, the belief that the universe was defined by a constant battle between opposing forces, was not new. The ancient Indo-Iranian traditions from which Zarathustra emerged already had a concept of cosmic struggle between light and darkness. However, Zarathustra's contribution was to place this dualism at the very core of his spiritual and ethical teachings. In Zarathustra's vision, the universe was not a place of mere chaos or randomness, as was often the case in polytheistic systems, where multiple gods and spirits clashed with one another. Instead, the world was defined by the tension between two forces of universal significance: Asha, representing truth, order, righteousness, and justice, and Druj, representing lie, chaos, falsehood, and deception. This struggle was not just a metaphysical or philosophical idea. It had real-world implications. The people of ancient Persia, much like other ancient civilizations, had lived under a constant threat of disorder. The natural world, with its cycles of seasons and harvests, was subject to both natural laws and unpredictable forces. Similarly, human society, too, was governed by moral laws, but frequently faced moral decay and corruption. Asha was the divine principle that ensured the harmony and balance of the world. Druj, on the other hand, threatened to unravel that harmony, causing chaos and suffering. What made Zarathustra's dualism so radical was that it applied to every individual. It was no longer a matter of appeasing the gods to avoid their wrath. It was about making a personal choice to uphold truth and righteousness. Zarathustra taught that every thought, word, and deed was either contributing to the cosmic order or to the forces of disorder. The battle between Asha and Druj was not simply a spiritual battle between deities, but a moral challenge faced by each individual. Every decision had cosmic weight. This was the foundation of Zoroastrian ethics, that the individual was both a participant in and a protector of the divine order. To align oneself with Asha was to actively work against the forces of Druj, both in the world and in the self. By framing this battle as an ongoing personal moral choice, Zarathustra offered his followers not only a spiritual path, but a practical moral framework to follow in their daily lives. This dualism did not just explain the nature of the universe, it provided a moral compass for living. Zarathustra's moral philosophy, encapsulated in the triad of good thoughts, good words, good deeds, was, at its core, a personal ethical system that stood in stark contrast to the ritualistic nature of ancient religious practices. At a time when most religions demanded external rituals, sacrifices, and ceremonies to appease the gods, Zarathustra introduced a system that focused on the inner life and the moral choices of the individual. Good thoughts form the foundation of this triad. The mind, Zarathustra taught, was the starting point of all actions. To cultivate good thoughts was to align oneself with truth, clarity, and order. This emphasis on the mind as the birthplace of righteousness marked a revolutionary shift from ritualistic religions that focused primarily on external acts of worship. Good words followed naturally from good thoughts. Zarathustra placed immense importance on speech, a reflection of the inner truth of a person. Words had the power to either uphold Asha, truth, or spread Druj, falsehood. In a world where oral tradition was vital and communication held immense power, Zarathustra saw language as an extension of divine will, and to speak truthfully was an act of spiritual purity. Lastly, good deeds embodied the full realization of this ethical system. Thought and word alone were not enough. A person had to live their truth through action, in everyday life, in dealings with others, and in the pursuit of justice. The moral agency was not left to the gods to decide, but placed directly in the hands of the individual. By choosing to live with integrity, to choose good over evil, in every moment, a person was fulfilling their divine purpose and supporting the cosmic order. This triad was not merely an ethical guideline, but a spiritual revolution. It was a direct challenge to the transactional nature of polytheistic religions, where the gods were appeased through sacrifices. In Zoroastrianism, The individual's moral purity, expressed through thoughts, words, and deeds, was the true offering to the divine. In Zarathustra's vision, the world was no longer defined by capricious gods and elaborate sacrifices. It was defined by the moral responsibility of every individual to choose truth over falsehood, justice over injustice, and order over chaos. Ahura Mazda, the one true God, embodied the ideal of divine goodness, but the true work was left to humanity. Zarathustra's teachings were not just a new theology, but a new way of living, one that sought to bring moral clarity and ethical responsibility into every action of daily life. This vision did not simply transform Persian religion. It laid the groundwork for future spiritual movements that would spread across the world. It was a vision of spirituality rooted not in appeasing the divine through rituals, but in embodying divine principles through moral agency, a philosophy that would echo through Christianity, Islam, and beyond. Zarathustra's challenge to the world was clear. The divine was not far off, distant and capricious, but within each of us, waiting to be realized through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Zarathustra's journey, once a solitary one of personal discovery and spiritual revelation, soon confronted the harsh reality of living in a world that was not ready for his radical vision. In the fertile plains of ancient Persia, where the rituals of the Magi had dominated for centuries, Zarathustra found himself in a battle not just for spiritual truth, but for survival. He was not just a prophet, he was a revolutionary, challenging the entrenched powers of the priesthood and the political system that had long ruled the land. The Magi, the priestly class, were not simply spiritual leaders. They were the gatekeepers of divine favor and the protectors of the cosmic order. To challenge the Magi's authority was to challenge the very fabric of Persian society. For Zarathustra to reject the multiple gods of the pantheon, to call for the worship of one supreme God, was not only a spiritual affront, but a political one. The Magi's power was intertwined with the people's belief in these gods, and by undermining that belief, Zarathustra threatened their political control over the masses. The priests saw in Zarathustra's teachings a dangerous new order, one that did not rely on ritual sacrifices and temple worship, but on the moral agency of the individual. Zarathustra's message that one could gain favor with the divine through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds rendered their elaborate rituals obsolete. This undermined the priestly monopoly over spiritual knowledge and divine favor. In the face of this threat, Zarathustra's persecution was swift and severe. He was labeled as a heretic, a blasphemer against the gods, and cast out of the communities that had once known him. His rejection was not just religious, it was political. As a prophet calling for a change in the spiritual system, he was seen as a direct threat to the social order. But Zarathustra did not falter. His faith, rooted in the divine vision of Ahura Mazda, remained unshaken even as he stood alone against the powerful forces that sought to silence him. The true test of Zarathustra's faith came when, after years of rejection and exile, a small yet significant miracle occurred. His first disciple, his cousin, embraced his vision. This first conversion, however, was more than just an act of personal faith. It was a moment of spiritual triumph, not only for Zarathustra, but for the entire movement. His cousin's acceptance of Ahura Mazda and the teachings of Asha became a tangible proof that his vision had the power to touch lives, even in the face of overwhelming resistance. For Zarathustra, this first conversion was a pivotal moment. It validated his belief that change was possible, that even in a world entrenched in polytheism, one person could choose to follow the truth he had revealed. The conversion of his cousin was a spark of hope, a moment of light in a world that seemed relentlessly dark. Zarathustra's loneliness had been eased, and his sense of mission became clearer. He was no longer simply a solitary figure on the fringe of society. He had a companion, and that companion was the first of what he hoped would become a growing movement. But this was not just a personal victory. It was a moment of spiritual strategy. Zarathustra knew that if one person could embrace his teachings, then others too might follow. It was not just a matter of convincing the powerful or the elite, but of reaching the hearts of those who, like his cousin, were ready to hear the call for truth and justice. The struggle would not be easy, but this first victory proved that Zarathustra's faith had the potential to change the world. Despite this early success, Zarathustra's journey was far from over. The years that followed were filled with deep spiritual loneliness. As he moved from village to village, spreading his message, he often found himself rejected, mocked, and at times even physically threatened. But it was in these moments of isolation that Zarathustra's inner strength was forged. He was no longer seeking external validation or approval. Instead, his faith had become internalized. His relationship with Ahura Mazda was now a deeply personal one, rooted in his inner conviction. He was no longer seeking the approval of society or the priesthood. Instead, his mission was to spread the truth, no matter the consequences. Rejection, isolation, and loneliness were no longer seen as setbacks, but as tests of his spiritual perseverance. What kept Zarathustra going during these dark years was not just his faith in the divine vision, but his deep belief that his teachings were the key to the world's salvation. He believed that if he could reach one soul, if he could inspire one person to see the light of Asha, then he was fulfilling his divine mission. The suffering he endured, whether it was the physical toll of years of travel, the mental burden of rejection, or the spiritual toll of walking alone in a world that seemed so far removed from his vision, only strengthened his resolve. Zarathustra was not a man of conventional leadership, nor did he seek to lead through force or violence. Instead, he led through the power of truth, which he knew would eventually permeate the world. His was a leadership that required patience, resilience, and an unwavering belief in the divine order he had been entrusted with. As the years passed, and Zarathustra's message continued to meet with resistance, he could not know for certain whether his faith would ever take root in the world. Would his vision of Asha spread to the farthest corners of Persia, or would it be crushed by the forces of tradition and political resistance? The priesthood, the royal courts, and the masses who adhered to the old ways continued to reject his teachings. Even as his first disciples began to gather, the overwhelming forces of inertia seemed insurmountable. Zarathustra had no guarantees that his mission would succeed, only the divine calling that had set him on this path. Would Zarathustra's faith endure, or would it be swallowed by the old world he sought to change? The moment Zarathustra stood before King Vishtaspa, it was not only the meeting of a prophet and a monarch. It was a clash of two worlds, one steeped in ancient polytheism, the other calling for an unprecedented monotheism that would challenge the very fabric of Persian spiritual and political life. In ancient Persia, the divine was not a matter of private devotion. The gods ruled not just over the heavens, but over the earthly realm. The Magi, the priestly caste, held immense power, not only in the temples, but also in the court of kings. Their role was indispensable. They were not just spiritual leaders, but also political advisors, interpreting omens, performing sacrifices to ensure victory in battle, and directing the moral compass of the nation. Their authority was such that to question their power was to question the stability of the entire Persian kingdom. King Vishtaspa ruled a kingdom caught between internal strife and external threats, a king who understood the delicate balance required to maintain peace. At the heart of his reign was a dilemma. The people, though devout, had started to question the old ways, the traditional gods, their demands for endless sacrifices, and the constant threat of divine displeasure seemed to offer no real solutions. Political unrest was growing, as well as a spiritual void that many could feel but could not articulate. The Magi's influence had waned, as their rituals seemed ineffective in a time when Persia was at the cusp of potential transformation. Vishtaspa, a man of wisdom, understood that the Magi's spiritual monopoly might be crumbling. He recognized that to secure his reign, he needed not just military power, but also the right divine legitimacy. He was, after all, a political leader, and the question of divine favor had always been integral to his ability to rule. If the people were dissatisfied with the gods and their traditional representatives, then his kingdom faced a grave danger. This political instability opened the door for Zarathustra, a prophet whose ideas about Ahura Mazda, a single god of truth, justice, and order, offered a potential solution. to the moral chaos that Vishtaspa sensed. Zarathustra's monotheism was not just a spiritual doctrine, it was a revolutionary blueprint for a kingdom in need of unity and ethical guidance. Zarathustra's call was not for more sacrifices, but for a moral life based on personal responsibility and alignment with the divine truth of Asha. The meeting between Zarathustra and Vishtaspa was not immediate in its acceptance, nor was it one of grand spectacle. There were no miracles or divine signs that convinced Vishtaspa. Rather, it was Zarathustra's quiet authority, his reasoned argument, and his moral clarity that began to slowly change the king's heart. Zarathustra spoke not with forceful prophecy, but with conviction in his beliefs. He argued that the world was not ruled by petty gods fighting amongst themselves for power, but by a single divine order, and that peace and prosperity could be achieved by aligning with that order, Asha, the embodiment of truth and justice. Zarathustra's message, however, was more than just a theological argument. It was a political one. His doctrine of moral action over ritual sacrifice spoke directly to the political concerns of Vishtaspa. The king was not simply looking for spiritual answers. He needed a moral code that could unify the people and provide a foundation for societal order. Zarathustra offered not just a religion, but a moral revolution, a way to restore balance without relying on ritual violence or appeasing a myriad of angry gods. In Zarathustra's teachings, Vishtaspa found a path to religious legitimacy that was no longer dependent on the corrupted priesthood, but on a moral law rooted in a single divine truth. The conversion of King Vishtaspa was not instantaneous, but a gradual process marked by philosophical debate, deep reflection, and quiet persuasion. Zarathustra's reasoned approach and theological clarity gradually won the king over. This conversion was spiritual, but it was also pragmatic. By aligning himself with Zoroastrianism, Vishtaspa could restore stability to his kingdom, reassert royal authority, and unify his people under a single divine banner. He saw in Zarathustra's teachings not only spiritual insight, but also a political strategy, a way to consolidate his rule through the power of divine order. With the king's conversion came political endorsement. Vishtaspa, with his royal influence, could now offer legitimacy to Zarathustra's teachings, which had previously been dismissed by the Magi and traditionalists. The royal backing that Zarathustra received allowed his ideas to take root across Persia. No longer was Zarathustra simply a wandering prophet. Now he had a powerful patron whose influence would help spread his message across the empire. This moment of conversion was a turning point not just for Zarathustra, but for the entire Persian Empire. Zoroastrianism was no longer a fringe religion. It was now the faith of the king, and as the king went, so too would the kingdom. Vishtaspa's conversion laid the groundwork for Zoroastrianism's rise as the state religion, marking the beginning of a new spiritual order that would eventually shape the empire's political and cultural destiny for centuries to come. In the vast court of King Vishtaspa, where sunlight filtered through carved stone columns and courtiers moved with choreographed precision, a quieter struggle had begun to unfold, one that few recognized at first. It began not with confrontation, but with questions whispered at the edges of royal discussions, carried discreetly into the private chambers where the king deliberated on matters of state. Zarathustra's arrival at the court had unsettled the balance of influence. His presence was quiet, but the implications of his teachings were profound. Persia's political system leaned heavily on the Magi, the priestly class who safeguarded rituals, interpreted celestial signs, and ensured the proper functioning of the old religious order. Their authority was rooted not merely in tradition, but in their ability to frame the will of the gods as the will of the state. For generations, they had maintained order by mediating between the divine and the political. Each sacrifice, each chant, each astronomical calculation reinforcing their indispensability. To the Magi, Zarathustra represented not a rival prophet, but a threat to the architecture of power itself. At first, they approached him with the calculated politeness that had been refined through decades of court diplomacy. They posed questions framed as curiosity, yet edged with the sharpness of testing. Zarathustra answered calmly, his reflections grounded in a vision of cosmic order that placed Ahura Mazda, not the pantheon, at the heart of all creation. His explanations did not dismiss the gods outright. Instead, he reframed them as emanations, aspects of a larger divine truth. This subtle shifting of spiritual hierarchy was far more dangerous than open rejection. The priests recognized the implications before the king did. In the early stages of debate, they challenged Zarathustra by appealing to tradition. They cited the rituals that had protected kingdoms from famine, prophecies that had guided armies, and ceremonies that had sealed alliances. But their arguments, though richly decorated with lineage and authority, lacked the ethical coherence that Zarathustra introduced. He spoke of a universe governed by moral order, not divine whim. Truth was not a tool of priests. It was the essence of creation itself. This was the first crack in the Magi's defense. Vishtaspa, a ruler accustomed to assessing competing advisors, sensed in Zarathustra a kind of clarity that contrasted sharply with the ornate complexities of priestly doctrine. He was not yet convinced, but he was intrigued. The priests felt the shift. Thus began the deeper phase of the debate, one that moved beyond ritual superiority into the realm of metaphysics. The Magi argued that the gods were numerous because the world itself was divided among competing forces: light, darkness, chaos, fertility, water, storm, and fire. Zarathustra listened, then countered with a vision that startled the court, a single, overarching intelligence that held these forces not in rivalry, but in ordered harmony. The world, he explained, did not need many divine wills clashing for dominance. It required only the light of Asha, the truth that made meaning possible. This argument destabilized centuries of religious assumptions. The Magi responded by questioning the practicality of such a system. How could a single God attend to the diverse needs of human life? How could one divine will speak to every tribe, every season, every crisis? Zarathustra did not offer threats or promises of grandeur. Instead, he introduced the concept that would linger in Vishtaspa's mind long after the debates ended. If truth was singular, then falsehood was equally singular. The struggle shaping the world was not between gods, but between Asha and Druj, truth and the lie. It was a cosmic conflict mirrored in every human decision, every political maneuver, every moral failing. This reframing was revolutionary. The Magi spoke to power. Zarathustra spoke to conscience. As the debate stretched over days and then weeks, the king began to see the difference between the two visions. The priests offered stability through ritual. Zarathustra offered meaning through responsibility. The priests preserved the past. Zarathustra illuminated a path forward. The turning point came not through a single argument, but through the gradual accumulation of one insight after another. The old system relied on fear, fear of storms, fear of spirits, fear of divine retaliation. Zarathustra's worldview rested on trust, trust that the universe had purpose, trust that good actions carried real weight, trust that truth was not a privilege of the few, but a universal calling. By the end of the debates, Vishtaspa recognized that adopting Zarathustra's teaching would not simply be a religious shift, but a moral reformation capable of unifying the kingdom at a time when tribal loyalties and competing rights created fragmentation. The king sensed that empowering ethical responsibility would stabilize the state more effectively than appeasing a dozen competing divine forces. What began as a quiet intellectual test had become the ideological foundation for a new Persian identity. The Magi saw it happening before the king declared it, and they understood the scale of the transformation. Their protests grew sharper, but the debates had already changed the atmosphere of the court. Servants whispered, nobles asked questions. The idea of truth, singular and radiant, spread in small conversations long before it spread across the kingdom. When Vishtaspa finally leaned toward Zarathustra, it was not the victory of one man over another, but the triumph of a new worldview, one that redefined Persia's spiritual future. The transformation of Zoroastrianism from a personal faith to a state religion was not a sudden shift, but a gradual and strategic evolution that unfolded over decades. In the beginning, Zarathustra's teachings were a mystical exploration, speaking to the individual's personal connection to Ahura Mazda, the one true God. His message was revolutionary, calling for the abandonment of polytheism and the rejection of a ritualistic, sacrifice-driven religion. At its core, Zoroastrianism was about living righteously. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. A deeply personal commitment to aligning with the divine order of Asha. But as Zoroastrianism began to take root, it became clear that a more institutionalized form of the faith would be necessary to meet the spiritual and political needs of the growing Persian Empire. The faith that began in the loneliness of Zarathustra's desert retreat could not remain a private, philosophical pursuit forever. King Vishtaspa's conversion and his subsequent political backing was the first major step in transitioning Zoroastrianism into a faith that could be embraced by royalty and the common people alike. As the faith gained royal endorsement, the question arose, how could a religion that was founded on individual righteousness be codified into a public, communal practice? Zarathustra's mystical teachings, which had been based on the personal connection between the individual and Ahura Mazda, now needed to be structured in a way that could be shared and practiced collectively. The need for formal rituals, prayers, and sacred texts became apparent, and this is where the Magi, the intellectual and spiritual custodians of Persian religion, stepped in. The Magi were more than just ritualists. They were scholars, philosophers, and political advisors. They understood the intricacies of Persian spiritual life and had been deeply involved in the religious practices that had defined the empire for centuries. Now they were tasked with translating Zarathustra's vision into something that could be codified, maintained, and ritually expressed. As such, the Magi became the key figures in transforming Zoroastrianism from a philosophical doctrine into a state-sanctioned religion. This transition was not without conflict. The Magi, who had long served the established pantheon of gods, initially resisted the singular worship of Ahura Mazda, as it threatened to undermine their spiritual monopoly. But the growing support of Vishtaspa, who recognized the political utility of a unified monotheistic faith, helped to sway the Magi's position. Over time, the priests and scholars of Persia found ways to integrate Zarathustra's moral teachings with existing practices, codifying rituals that could maintain the centrality of Ahura Mazda, while still accommodating the needs of a large, diverse society. As the faith evolved, the temple system emerged as a central structure for public worship. The sacred fires, which had been central to Zarathustra's vision of divine light and purity, became the symbol of Zoroastrian worship. The fire temples were built as physical representations of Ahura Mazda's presence on earth. These temples became centers of worship, but also community hubs where believers gathered to perform rituals, offer prayers and purify themselves in the presence of the divine fire. Fire in Zoroastrianism was not just a symbol, but an active participant in the divine order Ahura Mazda, as the creator of all, was believed to have imbued fire with divine power, making it the physical manifestation of truth and purity. For Zoroastrians, fire was the closest earthly reflection of Ahura Mazda's eternal light, which illuminated the universe, providing clarity and truth. The Magi, as the priests of Zoroastrianism, became the guardians of this sacred fire. In each fire temple, a sacred fire was maintained, symbolizing the eternal flame of truth that never went out. The rituals performed at these temples were centered around maintaining the purity of the fire, ensuring that it would burn continuously as a sign of divine favor and order. The Magi's role expanded with the growing importance of the fire temples. They not only conducted the rituals surrounding the fire, but were also responsible for the moral and intellectual training of the people. They were the ones who codified the holy texts, interpreting Zarathustra's teachings into practical rituals that could be carried out in daily life. As the Magi began to spread these practices throughout the kingdom, the faith became more institutionalized. It was no longer just an individual pursuit. It was now a community practice that involved every aspect of Persian life, spiritual, political, and social. Zoroastrianism as state religion, unifying the empire. As the faith spread and became more institutionalized, Zoroastrianism played a pivotal role in uniting the Persian Empire. No longer just a personal spiritual practice, it became a state religion, with its central doctrines now codified in ritual practices, prayers, and sacred texts. The Magi were responsible for maintaining the sacred fire, the cornerstone of Zoroastrian worship, while also spreading the ethical teachings of Zarathustra throughout the empire. As the faith became more deeply entrenched in Persian society, it began to shape the political landscape, influencing laws, governance, and the relationship between the people and their king. Through the sacred fire, the Magi, and the temple system, Zoroastrianism became a force that united the people of Persia under a single divine will, marking the dawn of an empire governed not just by royal decree, but by a shared moral and spiritual code. This shift would have profound implications for the empire's future, as Zoroastrianism would go on to shape not only Persia's spiritual life, but its political order for centuries to come. Zoroastrianism was no longer a personal faith, confined to small gatherings of followers. It had grown into a state-sponsored religion with rituals, temples, and a powerful priesthood that spread its message throughout the Persian Empire. Fire, once a mystical symbol of truth, became the very heart of Zoroastrian worship, symbolizing the divine presence of Ahura Mazda in the world. The Magi, transformed from mere ritualists into spiritual authorities, tasked with ensuring the faith's continuity and influence in the royal court and across the empire. This transformation laid the foundation for a religion that would influence the entire region, and its moral vision, focused on truth, justice, and goodness, would resonate in the hearts of countless generations, continuing to shape the world long after Zarathustra's teachings first emerged. The reign of Cyrus the Great stands as a monumental chapter in history, not only for his military prowess and the vast Achaemenid Empire he built, but also for the moral vision he infused into the heart of his governance. The connection between Cyrus and Zoroastrianism is a subject of scholarly debate, but there is no question that the ethical monotheism and sense of divine justice espoused by Zarathustra played a key role in shaping his leadership style and policies. Cyrus's reign was unique in the ancient world. Most kings at the time saw their power as absolute, with divine right to rule through force, cruelty, and religious exclusivism. But Cyrus, ever the diplomat and visionary, viewed his kingship through a lens that mirrored Zoroastrian principles that placed justice, moral responsibility, and the unification of peoples at the forefront of a ruler's duties. His approach to ruling was not simply based on political expediency or the imposition of will, but on a higher moral code that emphasized ethical governance as the divine will for his people. At the core of Zoroastrian thought was the idea that the king, as an earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, was entrusted with the task of upholding divine truth, ensuring justice, and promoting moral order in society. Zarathustra's teachings were revolutionary in this respect. Asha, or divine truth and order, was not a set of arbitrary rules, but the natural order of the cosmos that the ruler was expected to embody in his leadership. Cyrus's respect for divine order is reflected in the way he ruled, with tolerance, respect for justice, and an empire-wide policy of spiritual freedom. Cyrus's famous declaration in the Cyrus Cylinder, often regarded as one of the first human rights charters, speaks to this ideal. His policies of religious tolerance and respect for the gods of the conquered peoples mirror the Zoroastrian doctrine of not imposing religious will, but allowing all peoples to worship according to their customs. This was not an act of sheer political convenience, as some have suggested, but rather a deeply Zoroastrian-inspired understanding that the ruler must respect divine will, which manifests not in forcing uniformity, but in upholding justice and moral righteousness for all. While there is no direct evidence of Cyrus's personal religious practices, the spiritual climate of Persia under the Zoroastrian influence surely shaped his worldview. Cyrus's belief in justice, a recurring theme in both his inscriptions and historical accounts, was deeply intertwined with the the Zoroastrian principles of truth, Asha, and the rejection of deceit, Druj. The king's life was a reflection of the cosmic struggle that Zarathustra taught, a struggle between the forces of truth and falsehood, order and chaos. And Cyrus's leadership can be seen as a practical application of these moral ideals. As the Achaemenid dynasty took root, Zoroastrianism became not only a guiding philosophy, but a central structural element of the empire. The reign of Cyrus marked the beginning of Zoroastrianism's institutionalization, as the core principles of justice, truth, and royal responsibility were embedded into the governance framework of Persia. Cyrus's successors continued this path, embedding Zoroastrian ideals into the very fabric of imperial policy. The notion of divine justice was central to the governance of the Achaemenid Empire, and the influence of Zoroastrianism shaped the royal responsibility not just as an earthly task, but as a divinely ordained mission. Zoroastrianism's moral code, centered on Asha, truth and order, and Druj, chaos and falsehood, became the cornerstone of Persian legal structures and royal duties. The king, as the protector of Asha, was expected to uphold divine law, ensuring that his reign was aligned with the moral order of the cosmos. Under Darius and his successors, the Achaemenid Empire codified Zoroastrian values into their administrative systems. Laws were framed not just to maintain political order, but to reflect Zoroastrian ethics of fairness, justice, and accountability. The Magi, who were now integral to the administration, served not just as spiritual advisors, but as adjudicators of law, helping ensure that justice was applied in ways that reflected the divine will. This unique blend of religion and governance created a system where the king was not seen merely as a ruler of men, but as a divinely chosen agent of Ahura Mazda, a guardian of cosmic order. The Magi's role was essential in maintaining the integrity of this divine governance. They were not only responsible for the religious rituals of Zoroastrianism, but also played a critical role in ensuring that royal decrees and military actions aligned with the ethical framework of truth and justice. Through their oversight, the Magi ensured that the king's decisions were morally legitimate and in harmony with Zoroastrian values, acting as the bridge between divine and earthly authority. As the empire expanded, Zoroastrian principles were incorporated into Persia's bureaucratic and military systems. The Achaemenid kings, backed by the Magi and their interpretation of divine law, spread the idea of a unified empire grounded in the moral truths of Asha. This religious and ethical framework helped establish a common identity for the diverse peoples of Persia, uniting them under the banner of one moral order and one divine purpose. Through the reign of Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenid dynasty, Zoroastrianism became not only a spiritual doctrine, but a political and moral framework that shaped one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. Cyrus's rule, marked by justice, tolerance, and a commitment to divine order, laid the foundation for a governance system that was infused with Zoroastrian ethics. Zoroastrianism, with its focus on divine justice, truth, and moral responsibility, provided the moral compass for Persian rulers, from Cyrus to Darius I, helping them navigate the complexities of empire building and governance. The fusion of religion and governance under the Achaemenid Empire created a model for leadership that was both ethical and spiritually grounded, leaving a lasting impact on Persia and the ancient world. Through the Magi, the sacred fire, and the central role of justice and truth, Zoroastrianism became the guiding force in Persian rule, shaping the governance of one of the greatest empires in history, a legacy that would endure for centuries. Zoroastrianism's transformation from a personal faith to a state religion under the Achaemenid dynasty marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Persian Empire. The principles of Zarathustra, while first articulated as a personal path of righteousness and spiritual enlightenment, grew to become a system of governance that deeply shaped Persian art, political philosophy, and public life. The Achaemenid kings, particularly Cyrus the Great, Darius I, and Xerxes I, embodied the core ethical values of Zoroastrianism, ensuring that the faith's influence would be felt far beyond the walls of temples. At the heart of Zoroastrianism lay the idea of cosmic dualism, the eternal battle between Asha, the divine force of truth, order, and goodness, and Druj, the force of chaos, falsehood, and evil. This conflict was not only metaphysical, but also practical in the lives of the Persian rulers and their subjects. Under the Achaemenid kings, Zoroastrian principles of justice, truth, and moral responsibility became more than a guiding spiritual framework. They were enshrined in the very political and social structures of the empire. The Achaemenid Empire was a vast, multicultural state. From the steppes of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean, Persia ruled over diverse peoples and traditions. Yet, Zoroastrianism emerged as the unifying force that gave the empire a cohesive cultural identity. The faith's emphasis on divine order and justice provided a moral foundation for not only governance, but also the arts and architecture. Zoroastrianism profoundly shaped Persian art and architecture. The royal palaces of Persepolis, with their grand columns and intricate bas-reliefs, stand as lasting symbols of Zoroastrian influence. The images on the walls of Persepolis depict the king as not merely a conqueror, but a defender of divine order, a ruler chosen by Ahura Mazda to maintain Asha. Reliefs show the king in the company of various peoples, emphasizing the moral order that the Persian king was supposed to uphold. One transcended ethnic and cultural divisions, and these visual representations reinforced the message that justice and truth were the divine mandates of the king, and it was his duty to protect these principles. In the same way, Persian literature, especially epic poems and royal inscriptions, often conveyed the cosmic dualism inherent in Zoroastrian thought. The kings, as central figures in these narratives, were depicted as moral paragons, fighting against the forces of Druj. The great inscriptions of Darius the Behistan emphasize not only his military conquests, but also his role as a restorer of order, depicting him as the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, acting to ensure justice and truth prevailed. These inscriptions served both as political propaganda and as spiritual affirmations of Zoroastrian values. The royal courts reflected the ethical monotheism of Zoroastrianism as well. Zoroastrian ethics, emphasizing truth, justice, and the need for moral integrity in all facets of life, shaped the structure of Persian governance. Kings were not merely kings by bloodline, they were moral agents tasked with maintaining divine order in the world. The king's role was viewed as a divinely appointed responsibility to uphold the moral law of Asha. This made Zoroastrianism not just a religion of the royal family, but an essential framework for public life. It guided how the king ruled, how judgments were made, and how justice was administered across the empire. Even after the fall of the Achaemenid dynasty, Zoroastrianism continued to exert a profound influence on Persian society and beyond. The Sasanian Empire, which succeeded the Achaemenids, reaffirmed Zoroastrianism as the state religion, showing that the ethical ideals of Zarathustra had not just survived, but thrived across the centuries. The concepts of truth versus falsehood and ethical monotheism would continue to shape Persian governance well beyond the Achaemenid period. The Sasanian kings viewed themselves as not only political rulers, but as moral exemplars, responsible for upholding the divine order that Zoroastrianism emphasized. They promoted the idea that kingship was inherently connected to divine law, and royal responsibility was grounded in the king's duty to embody justice and truth. Even as Islamic influence spread across the region, the legacy of Zoroastrianism persisted. The concept of divine justice and the struggle between truth and falsehood continued to influence Islamic philosophers and the Persian intellectual tradition. Zoroastrian ideas were deeply woven into the fabric of Persian thought, influencing literature, philosophy, and even politics during the Islamic Golden Age. The concept of Asha, order, truth, and justice, found echoes in the teachings of Islamic scholars, particularly in discussions about morality, ethics, and the divine nature of kingship. But even as the empire flourished, new threats loomed on the horizon. The Islamic expansion posed a growing challenge to the old Persian world order. The faith of Zoroastrianism, while deeply entrenched in Persian culture, faced a formidable new force, a unified, monotheistic religion that would reshape not just Persian governance, but the entire religious landscape of the Middle East. Could Zoroastrianism, the guiding moral and spiritual force behind Persia's greatest empires, survive the coming storm of conquest and change? Or would the teachings of Zarathustra be swept away by the tides of history? The arrival of Alexander the Great in Persia in 334 BCE marked a dramatic and irreversible turning point in the history of Zoroastrianism. The ancient Persian religious order, firmly rooted in the teachings of Zarathustra, was confronted with the rising tide of Hellenistic culture and the spread of Greek philosophy, while Alexander's conquest resulted in the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire. The changes that followed were far more profound than mere political defeat. The Seleucid Empire, established by Seleucus Nicodor, brought with it an overarching cultural revolution that sought to Hellenize the Persian world, pushing Zoroastrianism into a defensive position. Unlike previous conquerors, Alexander's conquest was not aimed at complete cultural assimilation through destruction, but through integration and the imposition of Greek ideas. As Seleucus and his successors consolidated their rule over Persia, they sought to build new cities, encourage the settlement of Greek people, and foster the spread of Greek philosophy, art, and religion. For the Magi, this new Greek influence was a direct challenge to their spiritual authority and the religious traditions they had maintained for centuries. The Hellenistic worldview, emphasizing rationality and polytheism, directly challenged the monotheism at the heart of Zoroastrianism, where Zoroastrianism saw the world as a struggle between the forces of truth, Asha, and falsehood, Andruj. Hellenistic philosophy promoted the supremacy of human reason and often rejected the need for divine intervention. Moreover, the Greek pantheon of gods and the moral philosophy of Plato and Aristotle stood in stark contrast to the Zoroastrian ideals of an ordered universe governed by a singular divine will. For the Magi, the challenge was not only theological, but also political. Seleucid rulers were not religious zealots, but pragmatic administrators who saw little value in enforcing one religion over another. However, the creation of Greek-style cities across Persia, such as Seleucia and Antioch, exemplified the rise of a new cultural and political paradigm that marginalized the old Zoroastrian religious system. Zoroastrian rituals, once the foundation of royal and state practice, were now sidelined as Greek culture began to dominate and Greek gods and philosophers flourished. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Zoroastrianism did not simply fade into the background. The Magi, the priestly class of Zoroastrianism, became the keepers of the faith during this period of cultural and religious upheaval, while the urban centers of Persia fell under the sway of Greek influence. The rural regions and frontiers of the empire became sanctuaries for those who continued to hold the old ways dear. The Magi began to migrate to the less accessible regions of Persia, where they could continue their rituals and teachings away from the watchful eyes of Hellenistic administrators. These rural communities were often isolated, but they preserved the sacred fires, the Zoroastrian texts, and the teachings of Zarathustra, all while resisting the full force of Seleucid assimilation. Zoroastrianism, in many ways, went into exile not just as a religion, but as a resilient cultural force, finding refuge in the mountains, villages, and isolated towns of Persia, where the old ways could survive in secret. But the preservation of the faith was not simply a matter of religious devotion. It was also a strategic retreat. The Magi understood that the Seleucid Empire might weaken, that political power might one day shift, and that the Zoroastrian faith would eventually have an opportunity to reclaim its place in Persian life. Thus, the faith's survival was not just in spiritual terms. It was also about waiting for the right moment when the political tides would change again. This period of exile also saw the diasporic expansion of Zoroastrianism. Many Zoroastrians migrated beyond Persia's borders, particularly to regions like India, where they eventually became known as the Parsis. These communities carried with them not just the sacred fire, but also a deep sense of spiritual duty to preserve the moral vision of Zarathustra. Zoroastrianism in exile thus survived not only as a religion, but as a cultural identity that continued to evolve and adapt to new circumstances, even as it remained faithful to its original teachings. As the Seleucid Empire began to fade and new powers arose in Persia, Zoroastrianism found itself at a crossroads. The Parthian Empire would soon take the helm, and the Sasanids would eventually restore Zoroastrianism as the state religion. But the exiled Zoroastrians and the Magi in rural areas still faced the threat of cultural and religious annihilation. And even as the faith found new patrons, it had to reckon with the forces of history that sought to reshape Persia once again. Would Zoroastrianism thrive under the new dynasties, or would it once again be overshadowed by the expanding influence of foreign powers? The faith that had endured through so many trials now faced a new storm, one that would challenge its place in the world forever. When the Parthian Empire rose from the ruins of the Seleucid state in the mid-3rd century BCE, it found itself at the crossroads of competing political ideologies and religious movements. The Parthians, a nomadic tribe that had once been a thorn in the side of the Seleucids, were now poised to redefine the Persian world order. But to do so, they had to confront not just external threats, like the ongoing dominance of Greek culture and the remnants of Seleucid influence, but also the internal pressures from their own diverse territories and the religious challenges facing Persian society. For the Parthian kings, reclaiming Persia's spiritual identity was essential to reestablishing their legitimacy, while Zoroastrianism had been undermined by the Seleucid rulers, who imposed Greek religion and culture across Persia. The Parthians recognized the need to revive it. Zoroastrianism was not only the moral backbone of Persian rule, but also a tool of unity in a kingdom that stretched from the Iranian plateau to the edges of the Mediterranean. The Parthians' decision to support Zoroastrianism was, in part, a political strategy, a way to legitimize their reign and differentiate themselves from the Hellenistic rulers who had undermined Persia's traditional values. By aligning themselves with the Magi, the Zoroastrian priesthood, the Parthians sought to restore the divine right of kings. This move was part of a larger political agenda to present the king not just as a military leader, but as a moral and divinely appointed ruler, imbued with the spiritual authority granted by Ahura Mazda, the supreme Zoroastrian god. But this religious revival was not without its challenges. The Seleucid cultural legacy was deeply ingrained in many parts of the empire, especially in the urban centers, and the Parthians had to carefully navigate the Hellenistic influence while reasserting their dominance in a world shaped by Greek philosophy. For the Parthian kings, this meant balancing military power with religious and cultural diplomacy, ensuring that Zoroastrianism remained central to their political identity, while also accommodating the pluralism that defined their empire. As the Parthian Empire expanded, Zoroastrianism was not simply revived in a single, unified form, but instead began to reflect the diversity of the empire itself. The Parthian Empire spanned vast and varied regions, ranging from the Persian heartlands to the frontier territories of Mesopotamia and the Caucasus, and each area brought with it unique traditions, customs, and religious practices. The Zoroastrian faith, while unified by its core principles, had to adapt to these regional differences. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of regional temples and the growing influence of local priesthoods. While the Magi remained the highest religious authority, their power was increasingly distributed across various regions, where local priests took on greater responsibilities. These regional priests played a crucial role in translating the divine order of Ahura Mazda into practices that resonated with local communities. As the Zoroastrian religion adapted to regional customs, new rituals and celebrations emerged, often reflecting the local environment and spiritual needs. In the more urbanized areas like Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, the rituals became more formalized and linked to royal authority, often performed by priest kings who held both religious and political power. In the rural regions, however, the faith took on a more personal and community-based form. The sacred fire, central to Zoroastrian worship, continued to burn in temples and small shrines, but the rituals around it could vary, with local communities emphasizing different aspects of the faith, such as purification, sacrifice, or devotion. The development of regional variation also saw the introduction of certain syncretic elements. As Zoroastrianism interacted with Greek and Mithraic influences, certain aspects of local deities were integrated into the rituals. For instance, Mithras, a god associated with the sun, became associated with Zoroastrian themes of light, justice, and cosmic order, especially in Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. While the core Zoroastrian teachings on Asha and Druj remained intact, these regional variations allowed the faith to remain relevant in different contexts, ensuring its survival across the empire. The Parthian resurgence of Zoroastrianism marks a pivotal moment in the history of the faith. Under the Parthian rulers, Zoroastrianism regained its status as the central religion of Persia, used both to consolidate power and to define the moral fabric of the empire. However, the revival was not without its complexities. The Parthians had to balance the forces of Hellenistic influence with the need to reassert Persian identity, all while managing the regional variations that emerged as the faith spread across the empire. Zoroastrianism's ability to adapt, survive, and thrive during this period speaks to its resilience and the flexibility of its core principles. As the empire shifted and evolved, the faith too evolved, preserving its central teachings while allowing for regional adaptation. This cultural fluidity helped ensure that Zoroastrianism would remain a powerful force, shaping Persian identity for centuries to come and influencing the religious and political landscape of the ancient world. The Sasanian Empire, which rose to power in 224 CE, was not merely a political entity. It was a spiritual revolution in the Persian world. The Sasanians, inheritors of the Persian legacy, saw Zoroastrianism not as a relic of the past, but as a central component of their political legitimacy and imperial cohesion. As they ascended to power, the Sasanian kings, especially Ardashir I, understood the need for a unifying religion to consolidate their empire. To them, Zoroastrianism wasn't just a set of spiritual beliefs. It was a tool for creating national unity and reinforcing their divine right to rule. The Sasanians took a holistic approach to Zoroastrianism, integrating it deeply into their political system. Unlike the Parthians, who had allowed a degree of religious pluralism, the Sasanians centralized religious practice. Zoroastrianism was declared the state religion, and the Magi, the priestly class, were elevated to positions of power, becoming key players in the empire's political structure. The Magi were not merely religious figures, they were advisors to the king, guardians of the law, and enforcers of the cosmic order that Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrianism, represented. One of the most profound aspects of Sasanian religious reform was its centralization. Zoroastrian temples, which had previously been scattered and sometimes localized in practice, were now brought under the control of the Magi. The temples were not just places of worship, they became the epicenter of administrative and judicial functions. Kings like Shapur and Khosrow recognized that to hold their empire together, they needed a cohesive religious system that could permeate all layers of society, from peasants to the elite. Furthermore, the Sasanian kings linked their political sovereignty with religious authority. By promoting Zoroastrianism, the kings justified their reign as being divinely ordained, an idea that was not only tied to the royal family, but to the king's role as a divine agent of Asha, or cosmic order. Through their patronage of the faith, the Sasanians sought to demonstrate that their rule was in alignment with the divine forces of truth and justice. One of the most significant contributions of the Sasanian dynasty was the codification of Zoroastrianism. The Avesta, the sacred text of Zoroastrianism, had long existed in oral form, passed down by the Magi through rituals and hymns. But with the rise of the Sasanian Empire, a concerted effort was made to compile, organize, and standardize the text. This process of codification began under Shapur and continued under his successors. The Avesta was more than just a religious text. It was a manifestation of royal authority. The Sasanians understood that a unified scriptural tradition would provide both spiritual and political legitimacy. By compiling the Avesta, the Sasanians ensured that the Magi, who controlled the sacred texts, would also be the intellectual and religious guardians of the state. The codification of the Avesta had a significant political dimension. It allowed the Sasanians to control the religious narrative of the empire. It was through the Magi's interpretation of these texts that Zoroastrianism became inseparable from the Sasanian state, and the texts themselves became a tool for social control and unity. The Avesta's compilation not only solidified the religious landscape, but also unified the diverse regions within the Sasanian Empire. As Sasanian officials worked to ensure that Zoroastrian rituals were standardized across the empire, the Magi played an essential role in this project, overseeing the interpretation and dissemination of the texts. These efforts ensured that Zarathustra's teachings would remain central to Sasanian identity, and by binding religion so closely to the political realm, the Sasanians reinforced their control over both spiritual and secular matters. The texts once scattered and oral, were now codified, written down, and distributed as a unified canon that governed both the individual's relationship with the divine and their duties within society. This transformation, facilitated by the Sasanian monarchy and the Magi, ensured the Avesta's survival as the cornerstone of Zoroastrianism, providing not only religious guidance, but also national unity for generations to come. Despite the centralization of Zoroastrianism under the Sasanians, the empire's vast size and ethnic diversity meant that the religion continued to evolve in different regions, while Magi had authority in the imperial heartlands. The empire's borderlands, including Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the Caucasus, developed their own local interpretations and practices of Zoroastrianism. These regional differences were not necessarily a challenge to Sasanian authority. Instead, they were a reflection of the flexibility of Zoroastrianism itself, allowing it to adapt and thrive in varied cultural contexts. In the Mesopotamian regions, for instance, Mithraism, a Persian-influenced religion, began to spread, and there was a significant degree of syncretism between Mithraic and Zoroastrian beliefs. In Armenia, the influence of Zoroastrianism mixed with local pagan beliefs. These regional variations led to the adaptation of Zoroastrian rituals to meet the needs of local populations while maintaining the overarching principles of Asha and Druj. The Magi in these regions adapted the rituals, creating localized festivals, offerings, and even deities that spoke to local concerns. This development allowed Zoroastrianism to flourish in a multicultural empire, blending the core teachings of Zarathustra with local traditions without losing its unifying theological structure. The Sasanian reforms underpinned a golden age for Zoroastrianism, making it the official state-sanctioned faith of the Sasanian Empire. The codification of the Avesta solidified the faith's role in both spiritual and political life, ensuring that Zoroastrianism was deeply embedded in the empire's identity. The centralization of religious authority through the Magi and the sacred texts helped to unify the vast and diverse empire under a shared moral framework of Asha and justice. Despite the challenges of syncretism, regional variations, and the rise of competing religions, the Sasanians' commitment to Zoroastrianism ensured its survival. As a spiritual and political tool, Zoroastrianism was not only a religion, but the foundation of the Sasanian state, a legacy that would influence not only the ancient world, but also the future survival of the faith through the Zoroastrian Diaspora. The Sasanian era was a pivotal time for Zoroastrianism, as it found itself caught in a complex interplay between spiritual and political forces. With the rise of the Sasanian dynasty in 224 CE, the monarchy sought to not only consolidate political power, but also to revive and centralize Zoroastrianism as a state religion. However, this process of centralization was far from smooth, and it was marked by theological debates that would go on to define the faith for centuries. At the heart of these theological disputes were questions about the nature of Ahura Mazda and the divine cosmology of Zoroastrianism. The key issue was whether Ahura Mazda should remain the sole deity in a monotheistic structure, or if Zoroastrianism should continue to embrace a more polytheistic system with a pantheon of divine beings. This debate was not simply theological, but also deeply political, as the Sasanian kings needed a unified religious doctrine to legitimize their authority. Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity in Zoroastrianism, was now portrayed as the one true God, and the kings were seen as his divinely appointed rulers. However, this was not universally accepted by all factions within the Zoroastrian priesthood. The Magi, the priestly class of Zoroastrianism, were at the forefront of these debates. The more conservative elements within the priesthood resisted the centralized monotheistic interpretation of the faith. They were accustomed to the older, more polytheistic understanding of Zoroastrianism, where a variety of divine beings, such as the Ameshaspenta, holy immortals, and Yazatas, played a significant role. These beings, while subservient to Ahura Mazda, were nonetheless seen as important agents in the cosmic battle between Asha, truth, and Druj, falsehood. This view was deeply ingrained in the religious practices of rural communities, where rituals and deities were tied to local customs. On the other hand, the Sasanian kings, seeking to consolidate their rule and present themselves as divinely chosen monarchs, supported the monotheistic version of Zoroastrianism, where Ahura Mazda reigned supreme. This shift towards monotheism was not simply theological, but was also a strategic decision to unify the diverse regions of the Sasanian Empire under one spiritual banner. Zoroastrianism, now firmly tied to the state, became a tool of imperial power, with Ahura Mazda as the ultimate source of divine authority. This ideological transformation was a critical part of the Sasanian reforms, as the empire sought to distance itself from the Hellenistic and polytheistic influences of the Seleucid period. However, the move towards monotheism did not erase the dualistic nature of Zoroastrian cosmology. The struggle between Asha and Druj, while now framed within a more monotheistic context, continued to dominate the religious imagination of the Persian people. This persistence of dualism was a spiritual tension that shaped the faith, even as it aligned more closely with state power. The Magi, as the intellectual and spiritual elite, found themselves increasingly tied to the Sasanian state. The Sasanian kings used the Magi not only as religious authorities, but also as agents of state control. The Magi were tasked with codifying the Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, which had long been passed down in oral traditions. The king's decree that Zoroastrianism should be the central religion of the empire was backed by the Magi's role in ensuring the doctrinal purity of the faith. This process of centralization led to the creation of a more hierarchical system of religious authority, where the Magi were no longer simply regional priests, but were elevated to positions of political influence. They became advisors to the king and played a pivotal role in defining and enforcing religious practices across the empire. The Avesta was codified, and the teachings of Zarathustra were compiled into a more systematic and state-controlled framework. The process of standardizing the faith was essential for the unity of the empire and for reinforcing the legitimacy of the Sasanian rulers. However, this growing influence of the Magi led to internal tensions within the priesthood. Some factions within the Magi sought to preserve older practices, which were rooted in a more pluralistic view of the divine. They resisted the increasing monotheistic centralization of the faith, arguing that the diversity of divine beings in the Zoroastrian cosmology was essential for maintaining the balance between good and evil. These debates continued to simmer beneath the surface of Sasanian religious life, even as the monarchy pushed for a more unified and state-sponsored version of Zoroastrianism. The theological debates of the Sasanian period did not just shape the faith during the empire's height, they also had lasting consequences for Zoroastrianism's survival. The centralization of religious practice and the codification of the Avesta ensured that Zoroastrianism would endure beyond the Sasanian Empire. The unification of religious practice under the Magi, while it faced internal resistance, provided the framework for Zoroastrianism's preservation after the fall of the Sasanians. In the centuries to come, when the Islamic conquests would sweep across Persia, the Zoroastrian faith would be challenged, but it would not vanish. The Sasanian reforms, particularly their efforts to centralize and codify Zoroastrianism, ensured that the faith had a resilient framework to withstand external pressures. The doctrinal purity established under the Sasanians would become a defining feature of Zoroastrianism, influencing the Parsis in India and shaping the Diaspora communities that would carry the faith into the modern world. The theological debates that unfolded during the Sasanian era were not merely intellectual exercises. They were a vital part of the empire's political and religious transformation. The shift towards a monotheistic vision of Ahura Mazda, while imposing centralization, did not erase the dualism that had long been the heart of Zoroastrianism. These debates laid the foundation for the future survival of Zoroastrianism, ensuring that, even in the face of political upheaval and religious challenges, the faith would endure. The Sasanian era marked a period of doctrinal evolution, one that would have far-reaching effects on both the internal dynamics of the Zoroastrian community and its long-term survival across the centuries. The Arab invasion of Persia in the early 7th century was not just a military event, it was the beginning of a profound cultural, religious, and political transformation. The Sasanian Empire, having faced centuries of wars against the Byzantine Empire, was already in a weakened state. Internal struggles, including economic instability, political fragmentation, and an increasingly ineffective leadership, had undermined its power. This decline made the Sasanians vulnerable to the Arab forces that surged across the desert, driven by the new faith of Islam. The Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 CE proved to be the turning point in the struggle between the Sasanian Empire and the Arab invaders. The Sasanians, despite their long-standing military traditions, were caught unprepared by the Arab cavalry's swift and decisive tactics. The battle, which led to the death of the Sasanian general Rostam Farrukhzad, marked the collapse of the Sasanian military's ability to defend the empire. Ctesiphon, the capital, fell shortly afterward, and with it, the Sasanian state. But the Arab invasion was not simply a matter of defeating an empire. It was the end of a cultural world. Zoroastrianism, which had been the state religion of Persia for over 4 centuries, was faced with a new reality. The Islamic conquerors, while allowing Zoroastrians to retain some rights, imposed the jizya, a tax on non-Muslims, and began the slow process of Islamicizing Persia. The fire temples, the heart of Zoroastrian worship, were repurposed or destroyed, and Zoroastrian priests found their influence diminishing. Over the centuries, Zoroastrianism was pushed to the periphery of public life, but its spiritual legacy and its influence on Persian identity would not vanish entirely. The collapse of the Sasanian Empire marked the end of Zoroastrianism's dominance as a state-sponsored religion. The subsequent Islamic caliphates transformed the region, with Islam becoming the ruling faith. Yet, despite this cultural shift, Zoroastrianism persisted in hidden forms, carried forward by the communities that would later become the Parsis and other Zoroastrian diaspora communities. After the Arab invasion, many Zoroastrians faced persecution, forced conversions, and a loss of religious freedom under Islamic rule. Yet, Zoroastrianism did not disappear. Instead, a small but determined group of Persian Zoroastrians, the Parsis, sought refuge in India, where they would not only survive, but over time, thrive. Their migration to India around the 8th century CE marked the beginning of a new chapter for the faith, one that would not be defined by decline, but by resilience and adaptation. The Parsi community settled primarily in the western Indian region of Gujarat, where they were welcomed by local rulers who provided them with land and the freedom to practice their faith. This early Indian welcome was crucial, allowing the Parsis to preserve their Zoroastrian identity. The Parsis carried with them the sacred texts, the rituals, and the spiritual practices that had defined their religion for centuries. They rebuilt fire temples in their new homeland and maintained their religious practices, safeguarding the Avesta, the Holy Scriptures, which had been in danger of disappearing under the Arab domination of Persia. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Parsi community's success in India was their ability to adapt to their new environment while maintaining their religious traditions. While other religions, such as Hinduism and Islam, dominated Indian society, the Parsis found ways to integrate into the local culture without losing their faith. They became known for their business acumen, their roles in Indian industry, and their philanthropy. As a community, they contributed significantly to the cultural and economic life of India, even as they kept Zoroastrianism alive as a spiritual and social force. In addition to their economic success, the Parsis worked diligently to ensure that the teachings of Zarathustra continued to influence not only their own lives, but also the world around them. They established educational institutions to teach Zoroastrian principles, maintained a deep connection to their Persian roots, and preserved the rituals and ceremonies that had been passed down through generations. Zoroastrianism in India became a beacon of cultural continuity, a vibrant community that lived on in a new land, far from the Islamicized Persia they once called home. The Parsis' commitment to Zoroastrianism ensured the faith's survival and allowed it to flourish in ways that would not have been possible had they remained in Persia under Islamic rule. Their legacy in India is not just one of religious survival, but of cultural integration. How a small, marginalized community could thrive in an entirely different context while staying true to its ancient beliefs. The fall of the Sasanian Empire marked the end of an era for Zoroastrianism as the state religion of Persia. The Arab conquest irrevocably changed the political and religious landscape of the region. Zoroastrianism became a minority faith, and its once central role in Persian life was diminished. However, the faith survived, largely thanks to the efforts of the Parsi community and other Zoroastrian diaspora groups. The Parsis' migration to India and their ability to adapt while preserving their identity became a symbol of resilience. Despite centuries of upheaval and persecution, Zoroastrianism remained a living, breathing tradition carried forward by those who refused to let it fade from the world. Today, the Parsi community stands as a testament to the endurance of a faith that, though displaced from its homeland, continues to shape the cultural and spiritual fabric of the world. This journey from destruction to resilience is the true legacy of Zoroastrianism, a faith that, though tested by time, remains a living link to the ancient world. Even in the face of the Arab invasion and the fall of the Sasanian Empire, Zoroastrianism found a way to endure, adapt, and continue its influence on the world for generations to come. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next adventure.